All right, we've been given the green light to go, so let's roll. We're running a little bit behind, so I will go fast through the stuff that you've probably already heard before and focus more on demos. So if you're sitting here, you're probably here to hear a little bit about how to use Python with VMware Cloud on AWS. This is me, I'm Kyle Ruddy. I work for VMware in the R&D group that focuses on vSphere as well as VMware Cloud on AWS. Within that group, I focus on all things automation and developer related, which is all of our APIs, CLIs, SDKs. I'll skip through that really quick. So a little bit about the service itself. So if you've never heard of VMware Cloud on AWS, or this is your first time really seeing it, let me cover this really quickly. So basically, we're starting off with the AWS infrastructure, and then on top of that, on bare metal that AWS has provisioned for us, we're building out our vSphere implementation. So this is including vCenter for the management layer, vSphere and ESXi for the host information, using vSAN for your storage, NSX for all things that are networking related. However, since this is actually vSphere, underneath the covers, this can also, in effect, relate to your on-premises data centers as well. So this is literally just giving you a vSphere implementation in the AWS data centers. So things like hybrid link mode gives you the ability to log into a vCenter instance and be able to manage both your on-premises as well as your AWS-based vSphere resources. So that also gives you things like access to other things in the VMware ecosystem like vRealize automation, vSphere integrated containers, and so forth. Now, however, the cool thing is because we're out in AWS, that means that we also have a lot faster, lower latency access to the services that you're already running. The VMware Cloud on AWS service is running out there in the same availability zones that you're currently running services on today, and we're releasing more and more all the time to make sure that we have 100% coverage. I will take questions at the end, since I'm running late. So that was like a completely super fast overview of what the service is. I will absolutely take questions afterwards. But let's dive into the stuff that I enjoy talking about, which is the APIs that you can start utilizing to make use of the service. So there are three main endpoints that you need to be aware of. The top level is the CSP, or the Cloud Service Provider endpoint. This is essentially where all of your authentication happens. Now, if you're, say, an org administrator or an organization administrator, this is also where you're going to be doing some things like adding users, removing users, adding services, things of that nature. Now, from that point, once you're authenticated, you have access to this lower level, which are the other VMware Cloud-based services. We're here talking about VMware Cloud on AWS, so that's where you start having your hooks into that. And then since underneath the covers, VMware Cloud on AWS is vSphere, so you also have access to all of the vSphere APIs as well. Now, the important thing to note, especially if you are aware of some of VMware's history on our APIs, all of these that I've talked about so far, REST-based. So we're, no worries about having to use SOAP for anything whatsoever. And then I'll get into the documentation here in a second. Here's a little bit of a better visualization. Authentication happens at the top. You have access to all the other VMware Cloud services once you're authenticated in. In this case, we're talking VMware Cloud on AWS, and then that rolls you down into your VMware Cloud-based vCenter server. All right, so let's talk Developer Center. So this is something that is really cool. This is kind of a first for VMware, where we're providing access to developer-based resources directly as part of the UI. So, here's an example. We're in the Cloud Console. You literally have access to the Developer Center right there on the front page. Now, once you're in the Developer Center, you get access to a whole bunch of other things, which instead of me talking to a slide, I would rather do a demo. Because I think it's much cooler to show off. So we're in our Cloud Console here. We have a little bit of an overview just telling you what all is happening here. But the really cool thing that I enjoy and use quite frequently is the API Explorer. So if you're familiar with the Swagger UI, this is essentially the Swagger UI with a couple little nice additions. And so when I say nice additions, I mean, like let's browse down here to our SDDCs. We can see some information about the individual call itself. However, one of the niceties here, this is the on steroids part, is that it can also pre-fill in some information based upon which org you're logged into. Now, this isn't just limited to orgs, but this is also extended to your SDDCs as well. So here, we want to get more information about an SDDC. We already have our org information filled in. We can also go over here to the left-hand side, click on our SDDC, and in theory, there we go. It's already populated for us. This is also something that's receiving updates all the time. One of the cool things here is now we can start downloading the response body. So we can download that JSON file and start working with that right off the bat. The other really cool thing that was just added, literally I noticed it on last Saturday, we have the ability to download the OpenAPI Spec. So that is another really super cool addition that hasn't been there, and we're continually updating this. So if there's something that you see, you're like, this would be really cool if you added this, let us know, because we're doing a lot of work to enhance this. Outside of the API Explorer, we also have access to a number of code samples that are out there and have been shared on the VMware Code Sample Exchange. So we can see some stuff out here. Here's a PowerShell example from Brian Graff, a counterpart of mine. We have a Python resource to add and remove hosts. Let's see, here's our Terraform example, and a couple other things. So there's more things than just PowerShell and Python. There's stuff across the board, and these are all things that have been created or contributed by either community or VMware employees that have been curated. So there is somebody who's actually looking at these and saying, okay, this actually does work. It's not going to do anything nefarious. And I'll cover a little bit about the SDKs, but the SDK tab gives you the ability to go directly to one of the SDKs that covers the access to the VMware Cloud on AWS service. And then lastly, we have our downloads. Currently, that is access to our two CLIs that can make use of VMware Cloud on AWS. One is our data center CLI, which is a Python-based CLI. And the other one is Power CLI, which is our set of PowerShell modules. Oops, wrong way. There we go. All right, so it did the demo. So let's dive directly into actually using the Vsphere Automation SDK for Python. Okay, so we'll head over to our GitHub repo, and then we can do a git clone, which if I had additional time, I would have done this differently, but we can head out to our developer center, hit the SDKs tab, grab the Git repo from there. From that point, I'm taking the standard of being on a Mac that doesn't have a package manager, so I'm installing Homebrew here, so I can update the version of Python that's on the Mac system that I was using, because the preference there is Python 3.6 or better. So with Homebrew now installed, we just do brew install Python. It'll run through that pretty quickly, which let me fast forward because we're not showing too much. So now that we have our GitHub repo local, we have our Python 3 version installed, set up a virtual environment, jump over to that, hit activate, and then we can actually run through our setup requirements. So if we do an ls against our GitHub repo here that we've cloned locally, it's just pip3 install, hit the requirements, and feed it in the extra URL. Through the magic of video editing, we'll be done here in a couple seconds, but in reality, it takes about 2 to 3 minutes. But it's fairly easy, very straightforward. If you run into any issues, create an issue on the GitHub repo, or there's a couple walkthroughs as well. Let's see, and then it's going to update our Python path to include our SDK directory. All right, so that, extremely simple. That was just the install process. There have been questions on that. There are a couple of requirements, so you do have to run through that requirements portion of it. So let's dive into some of the example code that's included with our SDK. So we have a bunch of scripts that have been added to the SDK so that you can look at those, source them, add it to your own workflows, or build off what we have. So we're back in our terminal session. We're going to head over to our cloned Git repo, and then we're going to jump into our virtual environment. And then from that point, we're pretty much ready to start interacting with those scripts. So here we need to make use of our refresh token, which is the API token that's available in our Cloud console. And then from that point, we can run something straight out of our samples directory. So it's just into orgs and then doing our organization operations. So here, simple script gives you an output of the organizations that I have access to, as well as the first organization, and specifically in pulling out some additional information. Go faster. Then we're going to take one of the org IDs and get a little more information about our SDDCs that have been implemented here. So now we're going to run through the SDDC Crud example. So we're sourcing our refresh token, which we stored into a variable. Same thing for our org ID. And then it pulls back a list of the SDDCs that we have within this org that we specified. Then I believe we're going to create a network. So we're going through several different layers of management of where you can interact with the VMware Cloud on AWS APIs. So here we're going to run through creating a logical network, or rather listing a network, creating the network, listing it again, and then removing it. So we're going through the entire CRUD-based workflow. So we're doing our add here, spits out, hey, this is edge 2. That's going to be the ID for that. Then we can see that the logical network was actually created. We can get more information about the specific logical network itself. And then the next one is going to remove it. So that's just a couple examples of using some of the scripts that are available there. So let's do some actual interactive work with the SDDC or with the SDK. And in this case, we're going to take a look at an empty org and create an SDDC, and then actually start working with the vCenter without ever leaving our SDDC or our SDK. So in this case, I'm going to use a one-host SDDC because super easy to develop on, gives you all the features and things that you'll need to develop in a standard environment or larger. Just keep in mind that there is a 30-day limit on it because of the update process. And then as well, since you only have the one host, internal to that vCenter, vMotion's going to be limited, HA and DRS are not going to be available. So we're back in our terminal session here. We're going to move over to our, go over to our GitHub, or to our Git repo that's been cloned locally again. And then we're going to jump into our Python terminal. So from there, we're going to import some of the modules and the functions that we need to interact with here. We're going to use parse to grab out the vCenter URL later, tabulate to formulate and output some information there, and then our AWS SDDC config, account link config to help create our SDDC. But the most important one here is our create VMC client. This is what actually creates our session. So again, we're feeding in an API token, storing that into a variable called VMC client, and once we have that loaded, we can do tab completion. So we can start interacting with the API itself. In the API Explorer before, we saw things like orgs, or orgs and then SDDCs. That's exactly how this process is through. So for our orgs, we can do a list, then it's going to spit out org objects. Not very pretty, kind of hard to read, especially in this kind of work situation. So we'll use tabulate, put it in a table to make it a little nicer and easier to work with. So here are all the orgs that I have access to. No, it's just pretty simple. It's just vmcclient.orgs.list. So we saved one of our orgs, one of the org IDs into a variable there, and now we're going to start interacting with our SDDCs. So in this case, as I mentioned earlier, by doing orgs, SDDCs, then list, adding in our org ID, we see that we have no output. So we have no SDDCs available. Now we're going to make use of one of our helpers that we imported before. This is going to be the actual SDDC config. So this is where you set things like our region, your name, setting up the account link between your SDDC and your AWS account. But the other thing that I like about one-host configurations is I can delay that AWS account linking. So I don't have to do that right off the bat. I don't have to set up, or there's no requirement to have a VPC at that point. So I'm going to create that as an account link variable, just say delay account link set to true. We're going to dump this into US West 2, give it a name of reinvent demo SDDC with one host. And then at that point, we can use our create method, feeding in an org ID and our SDDC config. So if we go back to our console here, we went from nothing to deploying an SDDC. So if we go back, we store that into a task variable because what's returned is a task object. But again, we want to show that in a little nicer way, so we'll use tabulate again to dump that out. So we can see what our future SDDC ID is going to be. We can see some basic information about the task. But then we can also, since we have our task ID that was stored in that variable, we can also go and make a call against our tasks to get an updated status. So in this case, after a couple of minutes, our progress percent was at 16. So let's go ahead and fast forward a little bit and show how we can go start. There we go. So we fast forward in time a little bit, so our SDDC is actually deployed. We'll do another get against our tasks. We can see that our progress percent right here is 100, and then we'll simplify that by just pulling out the progress percent. So we know we're all set there. We don't have to go back to the UI to do anything. So now we can get more information about our SDDC by just doing a SDDC's list, inputting our org ID. We can see this is going to be that resource ID that we had before. We see the name that we used before. We're going to store our SDDC ID into a variable, and then we're going to pull out information about our vCenter. So as part of the configuration of the output for our SDDC-based information, it includes things like your vCenter URL, includes other things like your username and password. So all of those things are available right there. So now we're going to go ahead and import our create vSphere client function, which is going to work exactly like our create VMC client. But in this case, we're inputting our server, then we're sourcing our sddc.resourceconfig.cloud username. That's going to be our credentials. Same thing for our password. Then once that's done, we can start interacting with the API for that as well. So hitting vCenter, we can see cluster, data center, data store. This is the same exact API that you're working with on premises. So if we go ahead and do a VM list, call that, we see an output for all the VMs that are available there. But again, that's not all that easy to read, especially in demo situations. So we'll throw that through a table. So these are the basic VMs that are provisioned as part of your SDDC. So we have an NSX manager, a couple controllers, 2 edges, and most importantly, our vCenter. So let's make our first VM. So as part of that, we have a create spec that we can input, like what guest OS is there, what name it's going to be, where it's going to be placed. So speaking of where it's going to be placed, we can make use of the placement spec. So in that case, it's looking for folder, data center, or data store, and resource pool. So we're going to use that placement spec, give it which folders, resource pool, and data store to put in. Take note that we're inputting the IDs for those resources and not by name. Then from that point, we give it a name, guest OS, add in that placement spec, run it. So here we can see our create right there. So we've created a VM with a VM ID of 84. Going through our table again here, we see VM 84 there was added to the list. Now to get more information about this specific VM, we can do vcenter VM, do a get, input that ID, and then we can see some additional information like the name, power state, CPU count, memory allocation. Note, these two things were not something that we included as part of our specification. This was something that it pulled from the guest OS that we assigned to it. So based on being a CentOS 7 system, it assigned 1 CPU and 2 gigs of memory. So that was a really quick run through of using the Python SDK to start interacting with a VMware Cloud on AWS SDDC, and even take it to the point of starting to interact with that vCenter that's been provisioned. So that was, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, albeit that was, very much sped up. So one of the things to keep in mind, that was easy, but that was also done on purpose. There was a lot of thought and planning put into this because we're really focusing on making these resources really easy to use and really, accessible for our developers and automation specialists. Plus, we're adding a ton of samples, and we are absolutely looking for other people to contribute samples back to us. So keep that in mind. Please head out to the GitHub repo. If you have issues, open an issue. We're extremely responsive. If you create a new sample, either contribute it to the VMware Code Sample Exchange or directly to the SDK itself. So with that, I have a ton of URLs that are up here that should be on the recording, as well as will probably be shared, including a link to the Sample Exchange, the SDKs themselves, and more information about the Developer Center. So with that, that is all I have, and I think I have already gone over by 5 minutes. So thank you very much. I will be hanging around for a little bit, so if you have questions or any add-ons on top of that, I will certainly be here. So thank you.
Hey folks, we're giving away the Raspberry Pi sensors, so if you want to come see me, we'll get your card for a free sensor.
One microphone.